Section 6 of 6 Stories by George MacDonald. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alison Valdez. Section 6 The Broken Swords, Part 1. The eyes of 3, 2 sisters and a brother, gazed for the last time on a great pale golden star that followed the sun down the steep west. It went down to arise again, and the brother, about to depart, might return, but more than the usual doubt hung upon his future. For between the white dresses of the sisters shone his scarlet coat and golden sword knot, which he had put on for the first time, more to gratify their pride than his own vanity. The brightening moon, as if prophetic of a future memory, had already begun to dim the scarlet and the gold, and to give them a pale ghostly hue. In her thoughtful light the whole group seemed more like a meeting in the land of shadows than a parting in the substantial earth. But which should be called the land of realities? The region where appearance and space and time drive between and stop the flowing currents of the soul's speech? Or that region where heart meets heart, and appearance has become the slave to utterance, and space and time are forgotten? Through the quiet air came the far-off rush of water, and the near cry of the land-rail. Now and then a chilly wind blew unheeded through the startled and jostling leaves that shaded the ivy seat. Else there was calm everywhere, rendered yet deeper and more intense by the dusky sorrow that filled their hearts. For far away, hundreds of miles beyond the hearing of their ears, roared the great war guns. Next week their brother must sail with his regiment to join the army, and tomorrow he must leave his home. The sisters looked on him tenderly, with vague fears about his fate, yet little they divined it. That the face they loved might lie pale and bloody in a heap of slain was the worst image of it that arose before them. But this, had they seen the future, they would, in ignorance of the further future, have infinitely preferred to that which awaited him. And even while they looked on him, a dim feeling of the unsuitableness of his lot filled their minds. For indeed to all judgments it must have seemed unsuitable that the home boy, the loved of his mother, the pet of his sister, who was happy, womanlike, as Coleridge says, if he possessed the signs of love, having never yet sought for its proofs, that he should be sent amongst soldiers, to command and be commanded, to kill, or perhaps to be himself crushed out of the fair earth in the uproar that brings back, for the moment, the reign of night and chaos. No wonder that to his sisters it seemed strange and sad. Yet such was their own position in the battle of life, in which their father had died with doubtful conquest, that when their old military uncle sent the boy in an science commission, they did not dream of refusing the only path open, as they thought, to an honourable profession, even though it might lead to the trench grave. They heard it as the voice of destiny, wept, and yielded. If they had possessed a deeper insight into his character, they would have discovered yet further reason to doubt the fitness of the profession chosen for him. And if they had ever seen him at school, it is possible the doubt of fitness might have strengthened into a certainty of incongruity. His comparative inactivity amongst his schoolfellows, though occasioned by no dullness of intellect, might have suggested the necessity of a quiet life, if inclination and liking had been the arbiters in the choice. Nor was this inactivity the result of defective animal spirits either, for sometimes his mirth and boyish frolic were unbounded, but it seemed to proceed from an over-activity of the inward life, absorbing and in some measure checking the outward manifestation. He had so much to do in his own hidden kingdom that he had not time to take his place in the polity and strife of the commonwealth around him. Hence, while other boys were acting, he was thinking. In this point of difference he felt keenly the superiority of many of his companions, for another boy would have the obstacle overcome or the adversary subdued, while he was meditating on the propriety or on the means of effecting the desired end. He envied their promptitude, while they never saw reason to envy his wisdom. for his conscience, tender and not strong, frequently transformed slowness of determination into irresolution, while a delicacy of the sympathetic nerves tended to distract him from any predetermined course, by the diversity of their vibrations, responsive to influences from all quarters, and destructive to unity of purpose. Of such a one, the a priori judgment would be that he ought to be left to meditate and grow for some time, before being called upon to produce the fruits of action. But add to these mental conditions a vivid imagination and a high sense of honour, nourished in childhood by the reading of the old knightly romances, and then put the youth in a position in which action is imperative, and you have elements of strife sufficient to reduce that fair kingdom of his to utter anarchy and madness. Yet so little do we know ourselves, and so different are the symbols with which the imagination works its algebra from the realities which those symbols represent, that as yet the youth felt no uneasiness, but contemplated his new calling with a glad enthusiasm and some vanity, for all his prospect lay in the glow of the scarlet and the gold. Nor did this excitement receive any check till the day before his departure, on which day I have introduced him to my readers, when, accidentally taking up a newspaper of a week old, his eye fell on these words: "Already crying women are to be met in the streets." With this cloud afar on his horizon, which, no bigger than a man's hand, yet cast a perceptible shadow over his mind, he departed next morning. The coach carried him beyond the consecrated circle of home laws and impulses, out into the great tumult, above which rises ever and anon the cry of Cain, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Every tragedy of higher order, constructed in Christian times, will correspond more or less to the grand drama of the Bible, wherein the first act opens with a brilliant sunset vision of paradise, in which childish sense and need are served with all the profusion of the indulgent nurse. But the glory fades off into grey and black, and night settles down upon the heart which, rightly uncontent with the childish, and not having yet learned the childlike, seeks knowledge and manhood as a thing denied by the Maker, and yet to be gained by the creature, so sets forth alone to climb the heavens, and instead of climbing falls into the abyss. Then follows the long dismal night of feverish efforts and delirious visions, or, it may be, helpless despair, till at length a deeper stratum of the soul is heaved to the surface, and amid the first dawn of morning the youth says within him, "I have sinned against my Maker. I will arise and go to my Father." More or less, I say, will Christian tragedy correspond to this, a fall and a rising again, not a rising only, but a victory, not a victory merely, but a triumph. Such, in its way and degree, is my story. I have shown in one passing scene the home paradise. Now I have to show a scene of far differing nature. The young ensign was lying in his tent, weary but wakeful. All day long the cannon had been bellowing against the walls of the city, which now lay with wide gaping breach, ready for the morrow's storm, but covered yet with the friendly darkness. His regiment was ordered to be ready, with the earliest dawn, to march up to the breach. That day, for the first time, there had been blood on his sword. There the sword lay, a spot on the chased hilt sword. He had cut down one of the enemy in a skirmish with a sally party of the besieged, and the look of the man as he fell haunted him. He felt for the time that he dared not pray to the Father, for the blood of a brother had rushed forth at the stroke of his arm, and there was one fewer of living souls on the earth because he lived thereon. And to-morrow he must lead a troop of men up to that poor disabled town, and turn them loose upon it, not knowing what might follow in the triumph of enraged and victorious foes, who for weeks had been subjected by the constancy of the place to the greatest privations. It was true the general had issued his commands against all disorder and pillage, but if the soldiers once yielded to temptation, what might not be done before the officers could reclaim them? All the wretched tales he had read of the sack of cities rushed back on his memory. He shuddered as he lay. Then his conscience began to speak, and to ask what right he had to be there. Was the war a just one? He could not tell, for this was a bad time for settling nice questions. And there he was, right or wrong, fighting and shedding blood on God's earth beneath God's heaven. Over and over he turned the question in his mind. Again and again the spouting blood of his foe and the death look in his eye rose before him, and the youth who at school could never fight with a companion because he was not sure that he was in the right, was alone in the midst of undoubting men of war, amongst whom he was driven helplessly along upon the waves of a terrible necessity. What wonder that in the midst of these perplexities his courage should fail him? What wonder that the consciousness of fainting should increase the faintness, or that the dread of fear and its consequences should hasten and invigorate its attacks? To crown all, when he dropped into a troubled slumber at length, he found himself hurried, as on a storm of fire, through the streets of the captured town, from all the windows of which looked forth familiar faces, old and young, but distorted from the memory of his boyhood by fear and wild despair. On one spot lay the body of his father, with his face to the earth, and he woke at the cry of horror and rage that burst from his own lips, as he saw the rough, bloody hand of a soldier twisted in the loose hair of his elder sister, and the younger fainting in the arms of a scoundrel belonging to his own regiment. He slept no more. As the grey morning broke, the troops appointed for the attack assembled without sound of trumpet or drum, and were silently formed in fitting order. The young ensign was in his place, weary and wretched after his miserable night. Before him he saw a great broad-shouldered lieutenant, whose brawny hand seemed almost too large for his sword-hilt, and in any one of whose limbs played more animal life than in the whole body of the pale youth. The firm-set lips of this officer and the fire of his eye showed a concentrated resolution, which, by the contrast, increased the misery of the ensign, and seemed, as if the stronger absorbed the weaker, to draw out from him the last fibres of self-possession. The sight of unattainable determination, while it increased the feeling of the arduousness of that which required such determination, threw him into the great gulf which lay between him and it. In this disorder of his nervous and mental condition, with a doubting conscience and a shrinking heart, is it any wonder that the terrors which lay before him at the gap in those bristling walls should draw near, and, making sudden inroad upon his soul, overwhelm the government of a will worn out by the tortures of an unassured spirit? What share fear contributed to unman him it was impossible for him, in the dark, confused conflict of differing emotions, to determine. But doubtless a natural shrinking from danger, there being no excitement to deaden its influence, and no hope of victory to encourage to the struggle, seeing victory was dreadful to him as defeat, had its part in the sad result. Many men who have courage are dependent on ignorance, and a low state of the moral feeling for that courage, and a further progress towards the development of the higher nature would, for a time at least, entirely overthrow it. Nor could such loss of courage be rightly designated by the name of cowardice. But, alas, the colonel happened to fix his eyes upon him as he passed along the file, and this completed his confusion. He betrayed such evident symptoms of perturbation that the officer ordered him under arrest, and the result was that, chiefly for the sake of example to the army, he was, upon trial by court-martial, expelled from the service, and had his sword broken over his head. Alas for the delicate-minded youth! Alas for the home darling! Long after, he found at the bottom of his chest the pieces of the broken sword, and remembered that, at the time, he had lifted them from the ground and carried them away. But he could not recall under what impulse he had done so. Perhaps the agony he suffered, passing the bounds of mortal endurance, had opened for him a vista into the eternal, and had shown him, if not the injustice of the sentence passed upon him, yet his freedom from blame, or, endowing him with dim prophetic vision, had given him the assurance that some day the stain would be wiped from his soul, and leave him standing clear before the tribunal of his own honour. Some feeling like this, I say, may have caused him, with a passing gleam of indignant protest, to lift the fragments from the earth and carry them away, even as the friends of a so-called traitor may bear away his mutilated body from the wheel. But if such was the case, the vision was soon overwhelmed and forgotten in the succeeding anguish. He could not see that, in mercy to his doubting spirit, the question which had agitated his mind almost to madness, and which no results of the impending conflict could have settled for him, was thus quietly set aside for the time; nor that, painful as was the dark, dreadful existence that he was now to pass in self-torment and moaning, it would go by, and leave his spirit clearer far than if, in his apprehension, it had been stained with further blood-guiltiness, instead of the loss of honour. Years after, when he accidentally learned that on the very morning the whole of his company, with parts of several more, had, or ever they began to mount the breach, been blown to pieces by the explosion of a mine, he cried aloud in bitterness, "Would God that my fear had not been discovered before I reached that spot!" But surely it is better to pass into the next region of life having reaped some assurance, some firmness of character, determination of effort, and consciousness of the worth of life in the present world, so approaching the future steadily and faithfully, and if in much darkness and ignorance, yet not in the oscillations of moral uncertainty. Close upon the catastrophe followed a torpor, which lasted he did not know how long, and which wrapped in a thick fog all the succeeding events. For some time he can hardly be said to have had any conscious history. He awoke to life and torture when half-way across the sea towards his native country, where was no home any longer for him. To this point and no farther could his thoughts return in after years. But the misery which he then endured is hardly to be understood, save by those of like delicate temperament with himself. All day long he sat silent in his cabin, nor could any effort of the captain or others on board induce him to go on deck till night came on, when, under the starlight, he ventured into the open air. The sky soothed him then, he knew not how. For the face of nature is the face of God, and must bear expressions that can influence, though unconsciously to them, the most ignorant and hopeless of his children. Often did he watch the clouds in hope of a storm, his spirit rising and falling as the sky darkened or cleared. He longed, in the necessary selfishness of such suffering, for a tumult of waters to swallow the vessel, and only the recollection of how many lives were involved in its safety, besides his own, prevented him from praying to God for lightning and tempest, borne on which he might dash into the haven of the other world. One night, following a sultry calm day, he thought that mercy had heard his unuttered prayer. The air and sea were in intense darkness, till a light as intense for one moment annihilated it, and the succeeding darkness seemed shattered with the sharp reports of the thunder that cracked without reverberation. He who had shrunk from battle with his fellow men rushed to the mainmast, threw himself on his knees, and stretched forth his arms in speechless energy of supplication. But the storm passed away overhead, and left him kneeling still by the uninjured mast. At length the vessel reached her port. He hurried on shore to bury himself in the most secret place he could find. Out of sight was his first, his only thought. Return to his mother he would not, he could not, and indeed his friends never learned his fate until it had carried him far beyond their reach. For several weeks he lurked about like a malefactor in low lodging-houses in narrow streets of the seaport to which the vessel had borne him, heeding no one, and but little shocked at the strange society and conversation with which, though only in bodily presence, he had to mingle. These formed the subjects of reflection in after times, and he came to the conclusion that, though much evil and much misery exist, sufficient to move prayers and tears in those who love their kind, yet there is less of both than those looking down from a more elevated social position upon the weltering heap of humanity are ready to imagine, especially if they regard it likewise from the pedestal of self-congratulation on which a meagre type of religion has elevated them. But at length his little stock of money was nearly expended, and there was nothing that he could do or learn to do in this seaport. He felt impelled to seek manual labour, partly because he thought it more likely he could obtain that sort of employment without a request for reference as to his character, which would lead to inquiry about his previous history, and partly perhaps from an instinctive feeling that hard bodily labour would tend to lessen his inward suffering. He left the town, therefore, at nightfall of a July day, carrying a little bundle of linen, and the remains of his money, somewhat augmented by the sale of various articles of clothing and convenience, which his change of life rendered superfluous and unsuitable. He directed his course northwards, travelling principally by night, so painfully did he shrink from the gaze even of foot-farers like himself, and sleeping during the day in some hidden nook of wood or thicket, or under the shadow of a great tree in a solitary field. So fine was the season, that for 3 successive weeks he was able to travel thus without inconvenience, lying down when the sun grew hot in the forenoon, and generally waking when the first faint stars were hesitating in the great darkening heavens that covered and shielded him. For above every cloud, above every storm, rise up, calm, clear, divine, the deep infinite skies. They embrace the tempest even as the sunshine. By their permission it exists within their boundless peace. Therefore it cannot hurt, and must pass away, while there they stand as ever, domed up eternally, lasting, strong, and pure. Several times he attempted to get agricultural employment, but the whiteness of his hands and the tone of his voice not merely suggested unfitness for labour, but generated suspicion as to the character of one who had evidently dropped from a rank so much higher, and was seeking admittance within the natural Masonic boundaries and secrets and privileges of another. Disheartened somewhat, but hopeful, he journeyed on. I say hopeful, for the blessed power of life in the universe, in fresh air and sunshine absorbed by active exercise, in winds, yea, in rain, though it fell but seldom, had begun to work its natural healing, soothing effect upon his perturbed spirit. And there was room for hope in his new endeavour. As his bodily strength increased, and his health, considerably impaired by inward suffering, improved, the trouble of his soul became more endurable, and in some measure to endure is to conquer and destroy. In proportion as the mind grows in the strength of patience, the disturber of its peace sickens and fades away. At length one day a widow lady in a village through which his road led him gave him a day's work in her garden. He laboured hard and well, notwithstanding his soon blistered hands, received his wages thankfully, and found a resting place for the night on the low part of a haystack from which the upper portion had been cut away. Here he ate his supper of bread and cheese, pleased to have found such comfortable quarters, and soon fell fast asleep. When he awoke, the whole heavens and earth seemed to give a full denial to sin and sorrow. The sun was just mounting over the horizon, looking up the clear, cloud-mottled sky. From millions of water-drops, hanging on the bending stalks of grass, sparkled his rays in varied refraction, transformed here to a gorgeous burning ruby, there to an emerald, green as the grass, and yonder to a flashing sunny topaz. The chanting priest-lark had gone up from the low earth, as soon as the heavenly light had begun to enwrap and illumine the folds of its tabernacle, and had entered the high heavens with his offering, whence, unseen, he now dropped on the earth the sprinkled sounds of his overflowing blessedness. The poor youth rose but to kneel and cry from a bursting heart, "Hast thou not, O Father, some care for me? Canst thou not restore my lost honour? Can anything befall thy children for which thou hast no help? Surely if the face of thy world lie not, joy and not grief is at the heart of the universe. Is there none for me?" The highest poetic feeling of which we are now conscious springs not from the beholding of perfected beauty, but from the mute sympathy which the creation with all its children manifests within us in the groaning and travailing which look for the sonship. Because of our need and aspiration, the snowdrop gives birth in our hearts to a loftier spiritual and poetic feeling than the rose, most complete in form, colour, and odour. The rose is of paradise, the snowdrop is of the striving, hoping, longing earth. Perhaps our highest poetry is the expression of our aspirations in the sympathetic forms of visible nature. Nor is this merely a longing for a restored paradise, for even in the ordinary history of men, no man or woman that has fallen can be restored to the position formerly held. such must rise to a yet higher place, whence they can behold their former standing far beneath their feet. They must be restored by the attainment of something better than they ever possessed before, or not at all. If the law be a weariness, we must escape it by taking refuge with the Spirit, for not otherwise can we fulfill the law than by being above the law. To escape the overhanging rocks of Sinai, we must climb to its secret top. Is thy straight horizon dreary? Is thy foolish fancy chill? Change the feet that have grown weary for the wings that never will. Thus, like one of the wandering knights searching the wide earth for the Sangreal, did he wander on, searching for his lost honour, or rather for that he counted gone forever, seeking unconsciously for the peace of mind which had departed from him, and taken with it not the joy merely, but almost the possibility of existence. At last, when his little store was all but exhausted, he was employed by a market gardener in the neighbourhood of a large country town to work in his garden, and sometimes take his vegetables to market. With him he continued for a few weeks, and wished for no change, until, one day driving his cart through the town, he saw approaching him an elderly gentleman, whom he knew at once, by his gait and carriage, to be a military man. Now he had never seen his uncle, the retired officer, but it struck him that this might be he, and under the tyranny of his passion for concealment, he fancied that, if it were he might recognize him by some family likeness, not considering the improbability of his looking at him. This fancy, with the painful effect which the sight of an officer, even in plain clothes, had upon him, recalling the torture of that frightful day, so overcame him that he found himself at the other end of an alley before he recollected that he had the horse and cart in charge. This increased his difficulty, for now he dared not return, lest his inquiries after the vehicle, if the horse had strayed from the direct line, should attract attention, and cause interrogations which he would be unable to answer. The fatal want of self-possession seemed again to ruin him. He forsook the town by the nearest way, struck across the country to another line of road, and before he was missed, was miles away, still in a northerly direction. But although he thus shunned the face of man, especially of any one who reminded him of the past, the loss of his reputation in their eyes was not the cause of his inward grief. That would have been comparatively powerless to disturb him had he not lost his own respect. He quailed before his own thoughts. He was dishonoured in his own eyes. His perplexity had not yet sufficiently cleared away to allow him to see the extenuating circumstances of the case, nor to say the fact that the peculiar mental condition in which he was at the time removed the case quite out of the class of ordinary instances of cowardice. He condemned himself more severely than any of his judges would have dared, remembering that portion of his mental sensations which had savoured of fear, and forgetting the causes which had produced it. He judged himself a man stained with the foulest blot that could cleave to a soldier's name, a blot which nothing but death, not even death, could efface. But, inwardly condemned and outwardly degraded, his dread of recognition was intense, and feeling that he was in more danger of being discovered where the population was sparser, he resolved to hide himself once more in the midst of poverty, and with this view found his way to one of the largest of the manufacturing towns. End of section 6. Section 7 of 6 Stories by George MacDonald. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Section 7. The Broken Swords. Part 2. He reached it during the strike of a great part of the workmen, so that, though he found some difficulty in procuring employment, as might be expected from his ignorance of machine labour, he yet was sooner successful than he would otherwise have been. Possessed of a natural aptitude for mechanical operations, he soon became a tolerable workman, and he found that his previous education assisted to the fitting execution of those operations, even which were most purely mechanical. He found also at first that the unrelaxing attention requisite for the mastering of the many niceties of his work of necessity drew his mind somewhat from its brooding over his misfortune, hitherto almost ceaseless. Every now and then, however, a pang would shoot suddenly to his heart, and turn his face pale, even before his consciousness had time to inquire what was the matter. So by degrees, as attention became less necessary, and the nervo-mechanical action of his system increased with use, his thoughts again returned to their old misery. He would wake at night in his poor room with the feeling that a ghostly nightmare sat on his soul, that a want, a loss, miserable, fearful, was present, that something of his heart was gone from him, and through the darkness he would hear the snap of the breaking sword, and lie for a moment overwhelmed beneath the assurance of the incredible fact. Could it be true that he was a coward, that his honour was gone, and in its place a stain, that he was a thing for men, and worse for women, to point the finger at, laughing bitter laughter? Never lover or husband could have mourned with the same desolation over the departure of the loved. The girl alone, weeping scorching tears over her degradation, could resemble him in his agony as he lay on his bed and wept and moaned. His sufferings had returned with the greater weight, that he was no longer upheld by the divine air and the open heavens, whose sunlight now only reached him late in an afternoon, as he stood at his loom, through windows so coated with dust that they looked like frosted glass, showing as it passed through the air to fall on the dirty floor how the breath of life was thick with dust of iron and wood, and films of cotton, amidst which his senses were now too much dulled by custom to detect the exhalations from greasy wheels and overtasked humankind. Nor could he find comfort in the society of his fellow labourers. True, it was a kind of comfort to have those near him who could not know of his grief, but there was so little in common between them that any interchange of thought was impossible. At least so it seemed to him. Yet sometimes his longing for human companionship would drive him out of his dreary room at night, and send him wandering through the lower part of the town, where he would gaze wistfully on the miserable faces that passed him, as if looking for someone, some angel, even there, to speak goodwill to his hungry heart. Once he entered one of those gin palaces which, like the golden gates of hell, entice the miserable to worse misery, and seated himself close to a half-tipsy, good-natured wretch, who made room for him on a bench by the wall. He was comforted even by this proximity to one who would not repel him. But soon the paintings of warlike action, of knights and horses and mighty deeds done with battle-axe and broadsword, which adorned the panels all round, drove him forth even from this heaven of the damned. Yet not before the impious thought had arisen in his heart that the brilliantly painted and sculptural roof, with the gilded vine leaves and bunches of grapes trained up the windows, all lighted with the great shining chandeliers, was only a microcosmic repetition of the bright heavens and the glowing earth that overhung and surrounded the misery of man. The memory of how kindly they had comforted and elevated him at one period of his painful history not only banished the wicked thought, but brought him more quiet in the resurrection of a past blessing than he had known for some time. The period, however, was now at hand when a new grief, followed by a new and more elevated activity, was to do its part toward the closing up of the fountain of bitterness. Amongst his fellow labourers he had for a short time taken some interest in observing a young woman who had lately joined them. There was nothing remarkable about her, except when at first sight seemed a remarkable plainness. A slight scar over one of her rather prominent eyebrows increased this impression of plainness. But the first day had not passed before he began to see that there was something not altogether common in those deep eyes, and the plain look vanished before a closer observation, which also discovered, in the forehead and the lines of the mouth, traces of sorrow or other suffering. There was an expression, too, in the whole face, a fixedness of purpose, without any hardness of determination. Her countenance altogether seemed the index to an interesting mental history. Signs of mental trouble were always an attraction to him, in this case so great that he overcame his shyness, and spoke to her one evening as they left the works. He often walked home with her after that, as indeed was natural, seeing that she occupied an attic in the same poor lodging-house in which he lived himself. The street did not bear the best character, nor indeed would the occupations of all the inmates of the house have stood investigation, but so retiring and quiet was this girl, and so seldom did she go abroad after work hours, that he had not discovered till then that she lived in the same street, not to say the same house, with himself. He soon learned her history, a very common one as outward events, but not surely insignificant because common. Her father and mother were both dead, and hence she had to find her livelihood alone, and amidst associations which were always disagreeable and sometimes painful. Her quick womanly instinct might have discovered that he too had a history, for though, his mental prostration favouring the operation of outward influences, he had greatly approximated in appearance to those amongst whom he laboured, there were yet signs, besides the educated accent of his speech, which would have distinguished him to an observer. But she put no questions to him, nor made any approach towards seeking a return of the confidence she reposed in him. It was a sensible alleviation to his sufferings to hear her kind voice, and look in her gentle face, as they walked home together, and at length the expectation of this pleasure began to present itself, in the midst of the busy, dreary work hours, as the shadow of a heaven to close up the dismal, uninteresting day. But one morning he missed her from her place, and a keener pain passed through him than he had felt of late, for he knew that the plague was abroad, feeding in the low stagnant places of human abode, and he had but too much reason to dread that she might be now struggling in its grasp. He seized the first opportunity of slipping out and hurrying home. He sprang upstairs to her room. He found the door locked, but heard a faint moaning within. To avoid disturbing her while determined to gain an entrance, he went down for the key of his own door, with which he succeeded in unlocking hers, and so crossed her threshold for the first time. There she lay on her bed, tossing in pain, and beginning to be delirious. Careless of his own life, and feeling that he could not die better than in helping the only friend he had, certain likewise of the difficulty of finding a nurse for one in this disease and of her station of life, and sure likewise that there could be no question of propriety either in the circumstances with which they were surrounded, nor in this case of terrible fever, almost as hopeless for her as dangerous to him, he instantly began the duties of a nurse, and returned no more to his employment. He had a little money in his possession, for he could not, in the way in which he lived, spend all his wages, so he proceeded to make her as comfortable as he could, with all the pent-up tenderness of a loving heart, finding an outlet at length. When a boy at home, he had often taken the place of nurse, and he felt quite capable of performing its duties. Nor was his boyhood far behind yet, although the trials he had come through made it appear an age since he had lost his light heart. So he never left her bedside, except to procure what was necessary for her. She was too ill to oppose any of its measures, or to seek to prohibit his presence. Indeed, by the time he had returned with the first medicine, she was insensible, and she continued so through the whole of the following week, during which time he was constantly with her. That action produces feeling is as often true as its converse, and it is not surprising that, while he smoothed the pillow for her head, he should have made a nest in his heart for the helpless girl. Slowly and unconsciously he learned to love her. The chasm between his early associations and the circumstances in which he found her vanished as he drew near to the simple, essential womanhood. His heart saw hers and loved it, and he knew that, the centre once gained, he could, as from the fountain of life, as from the innermost secret of the holy place, the hidden germ of power and possibility, transform the outer intellect and outermost manners as he pleased. With what a thrill of joy, a feeling for a long time unknown to him, until now never known in this form or with this intensity, the thought arose in his heart that here lay one who some day would love him. that he should have a place of refuge and rest, one to lie in his bosom and not despise him. For, he said to himself, I will call forth her soul from where it sleeps, like an unawakened echo in an unknown cave, and like a child of whom I once dreamed, that was mine, and to my delight turned in fear from all besides, and clung to me. This soul of hers will run with bewildered, half-sleeping eyes and tottering steps, but with a cry of joy on its lips, to me as the life-giver. She will cling to me and worship me. Then will I tell her, for she must know all, that I am low and contemptible, that I am an outcast from the world, and that if she receive me, she will be to me as God, and I will fall down at her feet and pray her for comfort, for life, for restoration to myself. And she will throw herself beside me and weep and love me, I know. And we will go through life together, working hard, but for each other. And when we die, she shall lead me into paradise, as the prize her angel hand found cast on a desert shore, from the storm of winds and waves, which I was too weak to resist, and raised and tended and saved. Often did such thoughts as these pass through his mind while watching her bed, alternated, checked, and sometimes destroyed by the fears which attended her precarious condition, but returning with every apparent betterment or hopeful symptom. I will not stop to decide the nice question, how far the intention was right, of causing her to love him before she knew his story. If in the whole matter there was too much thought of self, my only apology is the sequel. One day, the 9th from the commencement of her illness, a letter arrived addressed to her, which he, thinking he might prevent some inconvenience thereby, opened and read, in the confidence of the love which already made her and all belonging to her appear his own. It was from a soldier, her lover. It was plain that they had been betrothed before he left for the Continent a year ago, but this was the first letter which he had written to her. It breathed changeless love and hope and confidence in her. He was so fascinated that he read it through without pause. Laying it down, he sat pale, motionless, almost inanimate. From the hard-won sunny heights he was once more cast down into the shadow of death. The second storm of his life began, howling and raging, with yet more awful lulls between. "Is she not mine?" he said in agony. "Do I not feel that she is mine? Who will watch over her as I? Who will kiss her soul to life as I? Shall she be torn away from me, when my soul seems to have dwelt with hers for ever in an eternal house? But have I not a right to her? Have I not given my life for hers? Is he not a soldier, and are there not many chances that he may never return? And it may be that, although they were engaged in word, soul has never touched soul with them. Their love has never reached that point where it passes from the mortal to the immortal, the indissoluble, and so in a sense she may yet be free. Will he do for her what I will do? Shall this precious heart of hers, in which I see the buds of so many beauties, be left to wither and die?" But here the voice within him cried out, "Art thou the disposer of destinies? Wilt thou, in a universe where the visible God hath died for the truth's sake, do evil, that a good which he might neglect or overlook may be gained? Leave thou her to him, and do thou right." And he said within himself, "Now is the real trial for my life. Shall I conquer or no?" And his heart awoke and cried, "I will. God forgive me for wronging the poor soldier. A brave man, brave at least, is better for her than I." A great strength arose within him, and lifted him up to depart. "Surely I may kiss her once," he said, for the crisis was over, and she slept. He stooped towards her face, but before he had reached her lips, he saw her eyelids tremble, and he, who had longed for the opening of those eyes as of the gates of heaven, that she might love him, stricken now with fear lest she should love him, fled from her before the eyelids that hid such strife and such victory from the unconscious maiden had time to unclose. But it was agony quietly to pack up his bundle of linen in the room below, where he knew she was lying awake above, with her dear pale face and living eyes. What remained of his money, except a few shillings, he put up in a scrap of paper, and went out with his bundle in his hand, first to seek a nurse for his friend, and then to go he knew not whither. He met the factory people with whom he had worked going to dinner, and amongst them a girl who had herself but lately recovered from the fever, and was yet hardly able for work. She was the only friend the sick girl had seemed to have amongst the women at the factory, and she was easily persuaded to go and take charge of her. He put the money in her hand, begging her to use it for the invalid, and promising to send the equivalent of her wages for the time he thought she would have to wait on her. This he easily did by the sale of a ring, which, beside his mother's watch, was the only article of value he had retained. He begged her likewise not to mention his name in the matter, and was foolish enough to expect she would entirely keep the promise she had made him. Wandering along the street, purposeless now and bereft, he spied a recruiting party at the door of a public house, and on coming nearer found, by one of those strange coincidences which do occur in life, and which have possibly their root in a hidden and wondrous law, that it was a party, perhaps a remnant, of the very regiment in which he had himself served, and in which his misfortune had befallen him. Almost simultaneously with the shock which the sight of the well-known number of the soldiers' knapsacks gave him, arose in his mind the romantic, ideal thought of enlisting in the ranks of this same regiment, and recovering as a private soldier and unknown that honour which as officer he had lost. To this determination the new necessity in which he now stood for action and change of life doubtless contributed, though unconsciously. He offered himself to the sergeant, and notwithstanding that his dress indicated a mode of life unsuitable as the antecedent to a soldier's, his appearance and the necessity for recruits combined led to his easy acceptance. The English armies were employed in expelling the enemy from an invaded and helpless country. Whatever might be the political motives which had induced the government to this measure, the young man was now able to feel that he could go and fight, individually and for his part, in the cause of liberty. He was free to possess his own motives for joining in the execution of the schemes of those who commanded his commanders. With a heavy heart, but with more of inward hope and strength than he had ever known before, he marched with his comrades to the seaport and embarked. It seemed to him that because he had done right in his last trial, here was a new glorious chance held out to his hand. True, it was a terrible change to pass from a woman in whom he had hoped to find healing, into the society of rough men, to march with the mit gleichem Tritt und Schritt up to the bristling bayonets, or the horrid vacancy of the cannon mouth. But it was the only cure for the evil that consumed his life. He reached the army in safety, and gave himself with religious assiduity to the smallest duties of his new position. No one had a brighter polish on his arms, or whiter belts than he. In the necessary moments he soon became precise to a degree that attracted the attention of his officers, while his character was remarkable for all the virtues belonging to a perfect soldier. One day, as he stood sentry, he saw the eyes of his colonel intently fixed on him. He felt his lip quiver, but he compressed and stilled it, and tried to look as unconscious as he could, which effort was assisted by the formal bearing required by his position. Now the colonel, such had been the losses of his regiment, had been promoted from a lieutenancy in the same, and had belonged to it at the time of the ensign's degradation. Indeed, had not the changes in the regiment been so great, he could hardly have escaped so long without discovery. But the poor fellow would have felt that his name was already free of reproach, if he had seen what followed on the close inspection which had awakened his apprehensions, and which, in fact, had convinced the colonel of his identity with the disgraced ensign. With a hasty and less soldierly step than usual, the colonel entered his tent, threw himself on his bed, and wept like a child. When he rose, he was overheard to say these words, and these only escaped his lips: "He is nobler than I." But this officer showed himself worthy of commanding such men as this private, for right nobly did he understand and meet his feelings. He uttered no word of the discovery he had made till years afterwards, but it soon began to be remarked that whenever anything arduous or in any manner distinguished, had to be done, this man was sure to be of the party appointed. In short, as often as he could, the colonel set him in the forefront of the battle. Passing through all with wonderful escape, he was soon as much noticed for his reckless bravery as hitherto for his precision in the discharge of duties, bringing only commendation and not honour. But his final lustration was at hand. A great part of the army was hastening, by forced marches, to raise the siege of a town which was already on the point of falling into the hands of the enemy. Forming one of a reconnoitring party, which preceded the main body at some considerable distance, he and his companions came suddenly upon one of the enemy's outposts, occupying a high, and on one side precipitous rock, a short way from the town which it commanded. Retreat was impossible, for they were already discovered, and the bullets were falling amongst them like the fist of a hailstorm. The only possibility of escape remaining for them was a near-by hopeless improbability. It lay in forcing the post on this steep rock, which, if they could do before assistance came to the enemy, they might perhaps be able to hold out by means of its defences till the arrival of the army. Their position was at once understood by all, and, by a sudden simultaneous impulse, they found themselves half-way up the steep ascent, and in the struggle of a close conflict, without being aware of any order to that effect from their officer. But their courage was of no avail. The advantages of the place were too great, and in a few minutes the whole party was cut to pieces, or stretched helpless on the rock. Our youth had fallen amongst the foremost, for a musket ball had grazed his skull, and laid him insensible. But consciousness slowly returned, and he succeeded at last in raising himself and looking around him. The place was deserted. A few of his friends, alive but grievously wounded, lay near him. The rest were dead. It appeared that, learning the proximity of the English forces from this rencontre with a part of their advanced guard, and dreading lest the town, which was on the point of surrendering, should after all be snatched from their grasp, the commander of the enemy's forces had ordered an immediate and general assault, and had for this purpose recalled from their outposts the whole of his troops thus stationed, that he might make the attempt with the utmost strength he could accumulate. As the youth's power of vision returned, he perceived, from the height where he lay, that the town was already in the hands of the enemy. But looking down into the level space immediately below him, he started to his feet at once. For a girl, bareheaded, was fleeing towards the rock, pursued by several soldiers. "Aha!" said he, divining her purpose, the soldiers behind and the rock before her, "I will help you to die." And he stooped and wrenched from the dead fingers of a sergeant the sword which they clenched by the bloody hilt. A new throb of life pulsed through him to his very finger-tips, and on the brink of the unseen world he stood, with the blood rushing through his veins in a wild dance of excitement. One who lay near him wounded, but recovered afterwards, said that he looked like one inspired. With a keen eye he watched the chase. The girl drew nigh, and rushed up the path near which he was standing. Close on her footsteps came the soldiers, the distance gradually lessening between them. Not many paces higher up was a narrower part of the ascent, where the path was confined by great stones or pieces of rock. Here had been the chief defence in the preceding assault, and in it lay many bodies of his friends. Thither he went and took his stand. On the girl came, over the dead, with rigid hands and flying feet, the bloodless skin drawn tight on her features, and her eyes awfully large and wild. She did not see him, though she bounded past so near that her hair flew in his eyes. "Never mind," said he, "we shall meet soon." And he stepped into the narrow path just in time to face her pursuers, between her and them. Like the red lightning, the bloody sword fell, and a man beneath it. Cling, clang, went the echoes in the rocks, and another man was down, for in his excitement he was destroying Angel to the breathless pursuers. His stature rose, his chest dilated, and as the third foe fell dead, the girl was safe. For her body lay a broken, empty, but undesecrated temple at the foot of the rock. That moment his sword fell in shivers from his grasp. The next instant he fell, pierced to the heart, and his spirit rose triumphant, free, strong, and calm above the stormy world, which at length lay vanquished beneath him. End of section 7. Meditating on the propriety or on the means of effecting the desired end. He envied their promptitude, while they never saw reason to envy his wisdom. For his conscience, tender and not strong, frequently transformed slowness of determination into irresolution, while a delicacy of the sympathetic nerves tended to distract him from any predetermined course, by the diversity of their vibrations, responsive to influences from all quarters, and destructive to unity of purpose. Of such a one, the a priori judgment would be that he ought to be left to meditate and grow for some time, before being called upon to produce the fruits of action. But add to these mental conditions a vivid imagination and a high sense of honour, nourished in childhood by the reading of the old knightly romances, and then put the youth in a position in which action is imperative, and you have elements of strife sufficient to reduce that fair kingdom of his to utter anarchy and madness. Yet so little do we know ourselves, and so different are the symbols with which the imagination works its algebra from the realities which those symbols represent, that as yet the youth felt no uneasiness. Section 6 of 6 Stories by George MacDonald. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alison Valdez. Section 6. The Broken Swords. Part 1. The eyes of 3, 2 sisters and a brother, gazed for the last time on a great pale golden star that followed the sun down the steep west. It went down to arise again, and the brother, about to depart, might return, but more than the usual doubt hung upon his future. For between the white dresses of the sisters shone his scarlet coat and golden sword knot, which he had put on for the first time, more to gratify their pride than his own vanity. The brightening moon, as if prophetic of a future memory, had already begun to dim the scarlet and the gold, and to give them a pale ghostly hue. In her thoughtful light they heard it as the voice of destiny, wept and yielded. If they had possessed a deeper insight into his character, they would have discovered yet further reason to doubt the fitness of the profession chosen for him, and if they had ever seen him at school, it is possible the doubt of fitness might have strengthened into a certainty of incongruity. His comparative inactivity amongst his schoolfellows, though occasioned by no dullness of intellect, might have suggested the necessity of a quiet life, if inclination and liking had been the arbiters in the choice. Nor was this inactivity the result of defective animal spirits either, for sometimes his mirth and boyish frolic were unbounded, but it seemed to proceed from an over-activity of the inward life, absorbing and in some measure checking the outward manifestation. He had so much to do in his own hidden kingdom that he had not time to take his place in the polity and strife of the commonwealth around him. Hence, while other boys were acting, he was thinking. In this point of difference he felt keenly the superiority of many of his companions, for another boy would have the obstacle overcome or the adversary subdued, while he was slain, was the worst image of it that arose before them. But this, had they seen the future, they would, in ignorance of the further future, have infinitely preferred to that which awaited him. And even while they looked on him, a dim feeling of the unsuitableness of his lot filled their minds. For indeed to all judgments it must have seemed unsuitable that the home boy, the loved of his mother, the pet of his sister, who was happy, woman-like, as Coleridge says, if he possessed the signs of love, having never yet sought for its proofs, that he should be sent amongst soldiers, to command and be commanded, to kill, or perhaps to be himself crushed out of the fair earth in the uproar that brings back, for the moment, the reign of night and chaos. No wonder that to his sisters it seemed strange and sad. Yet such was their own position in the battle of life, in which their father had died with doubtful conquest, that when their old military uncles sent the boy an ensign's commission, they did not dream of refusing the only path open, as they thought, to an honourable profession, even though it might lead to the trench-grave. The whole group seemed more like a meeting in the land of shadows than a parting in the substantial earth. But which should be called the land of realities? The region where appearance and space and time drive between and stop the flowing currents of the soul's speech? Or that region where heart meets heart, and appearance has become the slave to utterance, and space and time are forgotten? Through the quiet air came the far-off rush of water, and the near cry of the land-rail. Now and then a chilly wind blew unheeded through the startled and jostling leaves that shaded the ivy-seat. Else there was calm everywhere, rendered yet deeper and more intense by the dusky sorrow that filled their hearts. For far away, hundreds of miles beyond the hearing of their ears, roared the great war guns. Next week their brother must sail with his regiment to join the army, and tomorrow he must leave his home. The sisters looked on him tenderly, with vague fears about his fate, yet little they divined it. That the face they loved might lie pale and bloody in a heap